Well, here we are again on this beautiful spring day. Maybe things are actually getting a little brighter, um, warmer temperatures, and seems that the virus is abating. So maybe we can begin to socialize again. Um, we are, after all, social creatures. Well, I just heard from my marker that she finished grading the essays and is now proceeding to the exams. Um, and I just received this news, so I'll make sure that the um, the essays and your grades are available to you. I have to figure out exactly how to do this. It may be up on UmLearn. Give it a try. Uh, Going to UmLearn, see if there's some they're there in some fashion. But I'll attend to this um, by the end of the day. So the next thing is I want to do one more review questions and then get back um, to the narrative. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay. So we're at question 19. Question 19 basically says that the Hellenistic age was the shadow, the pale shadow. It was less than, from a cultural point of view, it was a come down from the height of the classical period, the Hellenic period, the period of the preeminence of Athens and Sparta, and essentially calls for a comparison of the two periods. So in answering this, one would begin by referring to this period from, say, 600 to 323, 350, 323. This is the classic period of the city-state. Institutionally, the city-state itself is an achievement with its city planning and its architecture and so on. It's a kind of framework within which we can say both individualism and political democracy thrived in this context. And indeed, as one of the philosophers of the period put it, man became the measure of all things. It stimulated creativity. And so you could briefly mention, like the last question, question 18, I reviewed basic achievements of the classical period. You could simply refer to them: philosophy, mathematics, history, theater, art and architecture, and so on. And then you would say that things changed with the conquest of Alexander the Great and the establishment of the Hellenistic monarchies. They were completely different from the city-states in that the Hellenistic monarchies, the Seleucid kingdom, the Ptolemaic kingdom, and so on, were, by comparison with the city-states, huge political entities based on large bureaucracies. And in this context, the individual was no longer, certainly democracy didn't exist, but also the individual was now an anonymous being within these large bureaucratic states. And there was a sense, I would say, and rather than a feeling of possibility, of individual possibility, there was a feeling of helplessness. And as a consequence, you could say that the creative spirit, which marked the previous age, tended to fade away. And sure enough, we see that the main feature of the Hellenistic period is basically imitation. They simply emulated, lived off the cultural capital of the classical period without being able to match the creative achievements of that earlier period. But to wind things up, one would note that even so, the Hellenistic period did see some significant cultural achievements. In contrast to the classical period, where the Greeks tended to be extremely ethnocentric and they paid little, well, they regarded everybody else as barbarians. There was a kind of an opening to the cultural influence of other peoples, what we would call a cosmopolitanism. Secondly, we could say that in art, whereas heroic realism was characteristic of the classical age, in terms of the sculpture and painting of the Hellenistic period, you see a real attempt to portray a real human emotion, to capture in a very realistic way the features of a particular situation or particular character. And furthermore, that perhaps the Hellenistic period lacked the perfect proportionality of the classical period. Nevertheless, there were monumental buildings, monumental projects, which had their own cultural significance. And in this connection, we see a real development of engineering, science, and technology following on from the classical period. In this respect, the achievements of Euclid, who basically sums up and organizes geometry, and Archimedes, who really develops what we call statics in physics, are quite important. Finally, this period did see a certain development of philosophy in the sense of personal philosophy, whereas Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle were interested in things like natural science, ethics, political theory. In this period, you see two great philosophical systems which attend to the search for meaning on the part of individuals who are essentially seeking some sort of personal solution to the problems of existence. Epicureanism and the end of the objective for human beings is the search for pleasure, and Stoicism, a kind of rational satisfaction in harmony with a rational universe, is what the Stoics are after. Are there any questions about this? Okay. I want now to turn back to the narrative. And I need to find yes, I'm looking for the I put these up last time? Uh, so I'm going to start it with sort of the very last segment of my last lecture that dealt with the triumph of Christianity. I'm going to sort of recapitulate that and add one or two remarks, and then we'll turn directly to the problem of the decline of the Roman Empire. Um, so in terms of the growth of Christianity, Christianity had advanced to a certain extent through the second century AD. There were intermittent persecutions and so on. But the third century is when Christianity really began to grow and to become a political force within the empire. And the basic reason for this is that in the third century, the Roman Empire entered into crisis. It wasn't yet the terminal crisis, but it was the beginning of the end, we can say, for the Roman Empire in the third century. There was, as you'll see, political crisis, invasions, but also within the empire, plague, depopulation, economic decline marks the third century. And in the midst of this, as the political structure of the empire is weakening, the church not only survived, but it thrived, it grew. Many more people joined it, and its structure became stronger. Indeed, its tight organization in the face of economic and political crisis, its tight organization, its large-scale charitable works, its charity in the face of deepening misery, and its stress on the afterlife. People were giving up on this life. Life on earth was proving increasingly unpleasant. And so the Christian belief in an afterlife proved more and more appealing to people. And as a result, Christianity became a significant and social force in the third century. Now, we saw last time that this amounted to basically the growth of as the Roman state got weaker, the church got stronger. And of course, it had sort of political dimension. So it is what we call the growth of a state within the state. The growth of a state, this sometimes happened, like you can see, for example, in Germany in the 1930s, there was the formal state constitutional government of Germany, but the Nazi Party was becoming a state within the state. Likewise, you can see that in the third century, the church is becoming a kind of state within the state. As a result, this emperor, a strong emperor, he instituted a deep persecution in order to try and root out what he regarded as a cancer within the state. But despite the thousands of Christians who were put to death, he was unsuccessful. And his successor, Constantine, faced with that and needing the support of the church, reversed his policy and began to, instead of persecuting the Christians, he began to favor them. And ultimately, when he established uncontested power, and I'll speak a bit more about this later, he made Christianity the state religion. And so at the end of the lecture, I said this is a remarkable metamorphosis, a remarkable transformation in the history of this religion, because it started out as an obscure Palestinian Jewish sect, and as a protest against the state, and it ends up becoming the state religion of the Roman Empire. And then, of course, I further made the point that whereas initially the church was highly egalitarian in character, by the year 300, it had an elaborate hierarchy, starting at the level of the bishops and going downwards to the ordinary Christians. A hierarchical structure had developed. And from the 4th century, after the death of Constantine, rather than being persecuted, it began to persecute others. Certainly, it persecuted heretics, people who were deviant in their Christianity, but also it began to persecute the pagans. They closed down the pagan temples, and they persecuted the pagan philosophers. They closed the academies that were teaching Plato and Aristotle and so on. These were closed down by the Christians. Not to speak of the Jews, who the first pogroms against the Jews, they actually came in the 5th century, and of course they were persecuted right through the Middle Ages on into modern times. I would note that I said that the Christian fathers did incorporate elements, particularly of Platonism and Stoicism, into their theology, but there was a definite sort of hostility towards kind of non-religious philosophy. The pagan philosophers, there was a great hostility toward them, and in fact, there was a certain amount of book burning, and even some of these philosophers, including a woman philosopher by the name of Hippolytia, were actually killed by these Christians. Now, this did not remain a characteristic of Christianity once it has established itself as the establishment. They did open themselves up to rational thought, and we'll see that during the Middle Ages, there was even a certain development of philosophy during the Middle Ages. I would say that in general, modern Christianity, most of the the various Christian groups do recognize the importance of secular philosophy and rational thought, except for the fundamentalists. We do have in Christianity, even today, a fundamentalist Christianity, which is hostile to reason. Same as we have this in Islam. There is a basic antagonism so far as they're concerned, between faith and reason. But that is not characteristic of most of Christianity, and for that matter, neither is characteristic of the more moderate versions of Islam. Now, the last thing I want to say about this is, well, the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire occurs in the 3rd century, but then there is then a kind of a period of peace in the 4th century, but then toward the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century, which we'll get to in due course, the whole thing collapses in the West. And the empire in the West, in particular, is overrun by Germanic tribes, so-called barbarians, sweep over what is now Western Europe and put an end to the Roman authority at the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century. We'll be examining that uh, after a while. But at the beginning of the 5th century, in fact, Rome, the city of Rome, was in fact attacked, and it was sacked by barbarians. And at that moment, the beginning of the 5th century, some pagan thinkers pointed the finger and said, aha, it's because the Roman Empire converted the emperors, turned to Christianity. That's the reason for the decline of the empire. The basic reason is the turning away from reason and the turn to Christianity. This is what has destroyed the Roman Empire. Well, there was an intellectual member of the church. He started out life as a pagan, but he converted. His name was Augustine, or Saint Augustine. He's one of the most important early Christian thinkers. He wrote a book in response to these accusations. It was called The City of God. The reason I'm referring to it is it is a work which is historical in its viewpoint. It looks back on the whole history of the ancient world and tries to give a rationale for why it's turned out the way it did. And Augustine's account is interesting because what he says basically is that the whole history of the world that we have known, starting in ancient times with Egypt and Babylon and so on, and proceeding through the Greeks and the Romans down to his own time, has been a succession of empires. And I've already said this is commonly understood, that the history of the ancient world is just a succession. Well, Augustine is I think the first who actually says this. Then he says, this has all been ordained by God. These empires have risen and fallen through a series of cycles. There have been cycles of rises and declines of each of these successive empires, but each one larger and grander than the last. But this has been all providentially ordained, because at the end of the day, this is what he called the city of man, the city of man. But what God has done is to use the development of the city of man in order to basically prepare the coming of the city of God, the contrast between the city of man and the city of God. At the end of history is the establishment of the city of God. Never mind the decline of any of these empires, including the Roman Empire. It doesn't really matter, because in the end is the establishment of the city of God on earth, which means essentially the establishment of the universal church of Jesus Christ on earth, the city of God, ruling on earth as it rules in heaven under God. So this was his rationale, and an interesting formulation well, he just dismissed basically the accusation that the Christians had caused the decline of the Roman Empire. No, this was the work of God, according to Augustine. Well, let's now turn away from religion per se and look at the problem of the decline of the Roman Empire. And I want to recapitulate this a bit. because it's important and interesting. Um, the problem of decline. This is a problem that people have been interested in really, I would say, the Europeans were interested in this since the Renaissance, since the 16th century, sort of trying to understand why Rome declined and so on. Well, the first classic statement, of course, is by Gibbon, Edward Gibbon, this Englishman who lived toward the end of the 18th century. He formulated the problem explicitly, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he did so because he was, of course, a member of this new imperialist country, Britain. What he said, he actually went back to the pagan writers, and he said the reason that Rome fell, why the Roman Empire fell, was Christianity. Because Christianity basically said that you shouldn't care about this world. This world doesn't matter. Just care about your salvation in the next world. Gibbon said, well, this had undermined the virtue of the Romans. The secular virtue, bravery, courage, devotion to the state had all been undermined by the Christians. And that's why the Roman Empire fell. That was his basic, he also had other explanations, but that's the main one. And of course, given the fact that Gibbon was his history is a masterpiece of literature, a lot of people gave credence to this, particularly because he lived in what we call the Age of Reason, the Age of Reason. Well, this explanation has been discounted by modern historians who basically say that, no, it's the reverse. The thing is that the Roman Empire declined because politically, economically, socially, there were these underlying factors that sapped it. And the turn to Christianity is an act of desperation on the part of the populations, rather than the cause of the decline. It's an effect. People are faced with terrible circumstances in their lives, and so they turn to the afterlife. They turn to Christianity as a possible way out. So Gibbon's view is not popular these days. Well, I've already mentioned some of the underlying factors, and I want to recapitulate those before I narrate the actual political and social circumstances of the decline. And remember, I said that basically most people in the empire, at its height, it had a population of 70 million, were poor. And despite the fact that the Roman Empire created this broad market, it wasn't very deep. Most people couldn't afford to buy very much in the market, and demand remained relatively shallow. And in particular, the connections between the East and the West. The eastern part of the empire was economically much stronger than the West, where there weren't too many cities and so on, and the merchant class wasn't particularly strong in the western part of the Mediterranean or up into France and so on. There was the market undergirding the political structure of the Roman Empire was relatively weak. That's one of the important factors. The second point I made was that the cities really were parasitic. They drained the wealth of the countryside without giving anything back, basically. The elites and those who were dependent on them lived in the cities. There was only a small manufacturing sector, relatively speaking. There was no reciprocity between economic reciprocity between farmers on the one hand and manufacturers on the other, which is characteristic of the modern period from 1500 onward. And so the cities really didn't contribute. Whatever else they didn't contribute economically. On the contrary. The third point I made was essentially over-exploitation. That is to say, not only were people poor, but they were very poor, and their health wasn't particularly good either. I'm talking about the slaves, of course, maybe 25 to 30% of the population, but also the peasants were overexploited and vulnerable to disease. That's a third factor. And I want to also single out the significance of the fact that so key aspects of the Roman state were dependent on slaves. This is important because the roads, the bridges, the public works were all built by slave labor, and the commercial agriculture that you see in southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa was largely based on slave labor. And once these people began to die off, there was nobody there to maintain the public works or to keep up a commercial agricultural sector. So the what I would call the die-off or the depopulation, which occurred during the 3rd century, the population declined by 1/3 as a result of the violence, the disease, the economic decline of the 3rd century. 1/3 of the population, especially the slaves, disappear. And who's going to maintain economic life under these circumstances? And of course, slavery had weakened the impulse to substitute technology for human labor, and there weren't enough machines to take the place of the absent population. And so finally, so those are the basic factors, but I would say that of course, ultimately we have to take account of the fact that all of this facilitated a political crisis and ultimately the invasion of the barbarians. And we can't ignore these things, the development of the political crisis of the 3rd century internally, and the first wave of the barbarian invasions, which occurred in that century. Well, let's develop the narrative. Well, we saw that the Principate came into existence at the end of the 1st century BC under Augustus. There was a certain amount of instability in the 1st century. The legions backed various factions and so on, and this culminated around the period, say, 68 AD, when in fact there were 4 generals vying for power. But this period of instability finally ended with the triumph of Vespasian and the establishment of a veritable dynasty, the Antonines, if I can find, who basically flourished between about 80 and 180 AD. These were emperors, and a whole line of emperors provided stability and peace during this whole period, which was backed up by economic, even a certain amount of economic growth provided by this great market. So this continued for a century until about 180. And then after the last of the Antonines died, suddenly an era of civil wars broke out. That is to say, the political ambitions of the generals who headed the Roman legions reawakened, and they began to fight for power, um, fight for control of the imperial throne, each of them trying to become Caesar or emperor. And so um, the the legions, instead of defending the empire, basically were fighting for power between themselves. Um, Moreover, um, it wasn't possible to limit the power of the army. One of the responses of the political establishment might have said, well, these people are just completely out of control. We just won't we won't fund the army, and therefore, without money, they won't be able to continue this self-destructive behavior of civil war. But it was impossible to do that because it's precisely at this period that the barbarians begin to cross the frontiers. And the army was more than ever necessary. The legions were more than necessary um, to combat the flood of barbarians who threatened the very existence of the empire. So far from diminishing the legions, they had to be expanded. And in fact, it's toward the end of the 3rd century, the numbers in the Roman legions reached a peak. The Roman army reached a peak of 500,000 men, 500,000 men. This was, antiquity had never seen an army this size, and we wouldn't see this again until modern times, until, in fact, the time of Louis XIV, at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. His armies were of a comparable size, but until then, this was, in terms of military mobilization, a peak. Let me. I want to say. Oh yes, I want to say that of course the armies were meant to contain the theoretical basis of this was to defend the empire. You needed 500,000 men. I just want to make the comparison with today, where the situation is quite different because what you have, and now I'm speaking about the United States, you have an enormous military establishment. Every year it gets $700 billion in funding, more than the funding of all of the states in the world combined. You add up the military spending of all the other states, it doesn't equal that of the United States. And of course, this military spending is meant to defend the American empire. The nearest competitor is actually China, which is now spending $200 billion a year. And this is going to rapidly expand, faced with the constant American threats against it. This is going to be the Chinese response. But the point is that, of course, there's a similarity in the sense that both are trying to maintain their empire. But whereas the Roman military establishment was an actual drag on as you'll see in a minute, on the economy of the Roman Empire, the American military spending is a form of state socialism. It's a direct subvention to private industry, and it basically helps keep the American. They won't spend money on infrastructure or very much money on infrastructure or on improving people's lives, but they will invest in military spending because it doesn't challenge the fundamental existence of the private economy. And it does stimulate the economy. It stimulates the economy. And I would say the same thing is true in Canada, exactly the same thing. Canada, the days when Canada was a so-called peacekeeper is long in the past. Canada emulates the United States in every respect. And it has military spending is an integral part of, a huge part of public expenditure in Canada. And Canada, within the American empire, has its own little empire in Latin America and even in Africa. Well, to come back to history, I'm mixing political economy and history. Why not? History is based on comparison. In any case, the civil wars reached their peak between 235 and 270 AD. Began after 180, but it reached its peak between 235 and 270, when no less than 22 generals, heads of different legions, were fighting for power. You can see an anarchic situation had developed in the Roman Empire. There was no effective political authority. It was chaos. And people were suffering. The violence was terrible. And the weight of taxation basically coerced from the population. What could they do? Was a terrible weight on the economy. Indeed, in order to sustain this, the state kept increasing taxes on the population, ruinous levels of taxation, indeed, outright seizure of people's property, and forcing people to deliver food and other requisitions from the extracting this from the population. And then in the midst of this, especially in that period, from about 235 to 270, a new wave of terrible plagues. The population became vulnerable to plague, and all told, as I said, there was a precipitous decline in population. 1/3 of the population disappeared, all told, during the 3rd century AD. There were fewer and fewer people, especially slaves, left to do the work, and no technology to take their place. Now, I want to speak about this decline in somewhat greater detail. We see that production, manufacturing output, food output declined. There was, therefore, while production declined, likewise demand declined because there were fewer and fewer people. But production declined even more than demand. And therefore, there was a kind of inflation in the midst of actual economic decline. There was an inflation because there was less and less food, there was less and less manufactured goods. And so scarcity of goods, prices rise, while actual output fell. This is a catastrophic situation. So much so, it was so bad that in the cities, the city officials, the Roman authority, the Roman state would say, you have to take so much and so much tax money from the population. And they told the city officials who were trying to manage the city finances, you better come up with the money or we'll confiscate your property. And they did. They took away the property of the mayors and the councils of the cities were stripped and expropriated by the state, which was hungry for taxes in order to pay the army. And of course, the merchant class as a whole was devastated by these conditions. And so the cities, in fact, the populations declined precipitously, merchants disappeared, city officials disappeared, and the cities withered during the 3rd century. The size withered. And one of the fundamental things that happened as a result of all of this violence, chaos, expropriation was that the landowning class, who after all were the ruling class in the society, they decided that life in the cities was no longer pleasant. And so what you see is that the landlord class, who had, from the Greek times, had always lived in the cities where all the pleasure and recreation was to be found, they began to leave the cities and they moved to their estates in the countryside. And they, on their estates, of course, there were slaves and there were peasants, and they basically built houses for themselves. We call them villas. And they tried to develop a kind of self-sufficient economy within the villa. So what I'm basically saying is that from the 3rd century onwards, this trend begins in the 3rd century, but it continues. You see an exodus from the cities, the dying of the cities, and basically the ruling class moves into the countryside, and the market economy declines, and essentially you get the development of kind of self-sufficiency in the countryside. Now, this trend is general right through the Roman Empire, but it's especially true in the western part of the empire, which always was the weaker part of the empire. In the East, the market economy and the towns survive better. And we could say that the East does survive this crisis, whereas in the West, it is really not arrested. We're really talking about the decline of the western part of the Roman Empire. The eastern part survives the crisis and turns into something else, which we call the Byzantine Empire. No longer the Roman Empire, something else. But in the West, the empire itself ceases to exist, and we enter the Middle Ages, as you will see. So this is the situation as a result of the crisis of the 3rd century that we've been discussing. Added to which is the fact that the barbarians are at the gates. The barbarians begin to spill over this weakened Roman Empire. The barbarians now spill over the gates, and the Roman legions are fighting, and they're in no position to resist. And in the midst of this incredible internal crisis, the empire has to face a barbarian invasion. And we'll see what happens in the next class. Good day.